Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we'll be covering Chapter 8, GDP, measuring total production and income. These chapters we'll be covering within Unit 2 lay the groundwork as far as main economic concepts we will be talking about in Unit 3. We'll talk about, in this chapter specifically, measuring GDP and national income, and we will see GDP again. Macroeconomics is extremely comprehensive in how it builds upon itself. So hopefully introducing these concepts now will enable them to stick in your head so that when we see them later, you will have a better understanding. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. In this chapter, we'll be introducing GDP, we'll be answering the question whether or not GDP measures what we want it to measure, or if it's an accurate measure of economic growth. We'll also be talking about real GDP versus nominal GDP and some other measures of total production and total income. Again, in this course, we're studying macroeconomics, which is the study of the economy as a whole. And so, before we get started, really, we want to define some important macroeconomic terms. Again, we'll see these terms a little bit later in the unit in some of the other chapters. We have business cycle, expansion, recession, economic growth, and the inflation rate. Business cycle is alternating periods of economic expansion. There's a little bit of a typo here. And economic recession. Expansion occurs when total production and total employment are rising, while recession occurs when total production and total employment are falling. Economic growth is the ability of an economy to produce increasing quantities of goods and services, and we have our inflation rate, which is the percent increase in price level from one year to the next. We'll talk about inflation in Chapter 9, as well as unemployment. So, what is real GDP? Real GDP is the most common measure used by economists to measure overall economic activity within an economy. The goal of this chapter is to measure total output of an economy, and so GDP is a useful measure for economists. We're going to analyze the definition of GDP in turn, each component. So the words we want to focus on within the definition are the market value, final goods and services, and during a period of time. Okay, so market value of all final goods and services. We're not going to be able to add together the quantities produced of goods and services without first agreeing on a common way to measure them. We need to determine a value for each good and service in monetary terms. And the best value or the best measure of this value is the price each good or service is sold for. Okay, so what's a final good and service, you might ask? Final good and service is one that is purchased by a final user. Okay, so why are we talking about final goods and services? So if we counted intermediate goods and services, such as things that are included in inputs of another good or service, we would end up double counting. So if we think about selling ice cream, that's the example that's used in the PowerPoint. If we also counted the value of the ice cream that was first bought by the store, so the cost of the ice cream purchased from the wholesaler, and counted it as well as the actual value of the ice cream that is purchased by the consumer, we'd be double counting that wholesale value. So we only want to think about that final value. Again, still talking about final goods and services. it's produced in a country. So GDP measures output produced within the country's borders. Production of the ownership production is irrelevant. So as long as production takes place in the US, it's counted. However, production overseas doesn't count even if it's performed by a US firm. Finally, during a period of time, we need to set a period of time to avoid double counting again. So typically we use a given year because we don't want to count things that are sold in another year. So GDP is only counting new goods and services. Used items that were previously produced in a different year potentially and counted in a different year aren't going to be counted again. Okay, so as far as measuring total economic activity, we have two conceptual ways that we do that. One through total production, one through total income. They're essentially the same because when we measure one, we're also measuring the other. Everything that's produced and sold is income for someone, so we can either measure the value of the products produced and sold or the value of the incomes received. Okay. The PowerPoint walks you through a little bit of the circular flow model and GDP, but we're not going to be getting into that too much. We're going to go ahead and move on to follow spending to measure GDP. So, GDP is measured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the Department of Commerce. There's going to be four major categories of expenditures. We have consumption, investment, government expenditures, government purchases, or net exports. Excuse me. So GDP is expressed as the sum of these. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Y is output. So we're going to talk about each one in turn. First, let's talk about consumption. So consumption is going to be spending on goods and services by households, not including investment spending on new homes. So some examples of these are services including medical care, education, haircuts, nail salon, retail, etc. Non-durable goods, food and clothing are examples of non-durable goods and durable goods. Automobiles, large appliances, furniture, etc. So what is the difference between durable and non-durable goods? A non-durable good is typically in service less than 3 years. While a durable good can be used for more than 3 years. So durable goods are much more likely to be affected by a recession than non-durable goods. Okay. Another thing to note about consumption is it is the largest component of GDP. Okay. So let's move on to investment. So the I component of output. Investment is spending by firms on new factories, office buildings, machinery, inventory additions, new houses. And so we have different categories of investment, similarly to consumption. In investment, we have business fixed investment, residential investment, and changes in business inventories. Business fixed investment includes those new factories, R&D, office buildings, machinery, etc. Residential investment is new family homes, either single family or multi-unit houses. And then changes in business inventories talks about goods that are produced but not yet sold. Keep in mind that investment in economics doesn't refer to buying stocks and bonds like it does in finance. Investment, we're talking about actual machines or buildings or capital used to produce other goods and services. Okay? Again, just keep in mind we have y equals c plus I plus g plus nx is our equation for GDP. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to government purchases, the G component. Government purchases includes federal, state, and local spending, goods and services, government consumption, and government investment is also included. It doesn't include transfer payments because this doesn't immediately result in the production of a new good or service. Oh, put that in the wrong place. Does not include transfer payments. Okay. Finally, we have our net exports component. Net exports equals exports, minus imports. So this difference can be either positive or negative. In most recent years, it's been negative in the US. If we want to count just domestic production, we're going to add up the values of the goods and services sold to foreigners and subtract the values of goods and services sold to Americans by foreigners. Export is not counted otherwise in C or I or G, so we're going to have to count it somehow in production. Import is counted usually in consumption, but we are trying to measure domestic production, so we don't want to count it. We need to subtract off the imports in order to just measure domestic production. Okay. So another way we can calculate GDP is using the value added method, which is the market value a firm adds to a product. Keep in mind that the final selling price of a product has to equal the sum of the values added to the product at each stage of production. So if we think about breaking down the production of a specific good into separate firms, we can see how each firm adds value to a product, and eventually the product is sold at a specific price, and that total value added adds up to that specific price. So, with that being said, in general, GDP has been talked about a lot in the past year, especially regards to COVID and how it's impacted GDP. If we think about how it's impacted specifically non-durable goods, specifically restaurant services and food produced by restaurants, we can also think about how investment's been affected as well. Companies aren't necessarily wanting to expand during the pandemic because they don't have enough liquidity to do so right now. And so, because of that, there were quite a few people who were laid off during this time as well. And we'll look into the unemployment factor of the pandemic in chapter 9. but I do want to show you one useful link that I have used in my classes specifically, and it's the Fred database here. It's data compiled by the St. Louis Fed, Federal Reserve Bank. We'll get into that when we talk about monetary policy, but we can see here a graphical representation of GDP and how over the quarters of Q1 in 2020 and Q2 of 2020 through Q4 of 2020, we've seen a drop in GDP and subsequent increase back up to close to the levels before. We can see that this decline in comparison to the 2018 recession was much more sharp. And so there was clearly a difference between these two recessions. So we will keep talking about GDP, but now we want to shift gears and ask the question, does it measure what we want it to measure? So it's important to note that GDP doesn't include specific things. It has shortcomings. It's useful, but it may not be the best measure of well-being within society, right? So GDP does not necessarily measure total production the best, and it doesn't necessarily measure well-being the best. So let's note two specific types of production that are omitted from this measurement. One, household production, childcare, cleaning, cooking, washing your own car. It's not necessarily always paid for with money, right? If you do that by yourself or on your own, you're a caretaker, you are contributing to the economy. Those are real contributions, but they aren't measured in GDP. They would be measured, however, if they were paid for. So if you pay for a babysitter or a nanny, or you pay for a car wash subscription, they would be paid for and counted in GDP. So that's something that GDP doesn't account for. And the second thing is the underground economy. So buying and selling goods and services that are concealed from the government in order to avoid taxes, regulations, or because the goods and services are illegal. So think about all the movement of drug trafficking, and also other types of illegal activity that is production within the US, but it's not measured, right? Because sometimes it's difficult to measure that, and also it's illegal oftentimes. It's important to note that low-income countries, they may have a larger percentage of underground activity that makes up their economy. So it's very interesting to think about how the underground economy affects the, I guess you would call it the above ground economy. They're very much so intertwined, and it's just very fascinating. There are quite a few books written about drug trafficking and that sort of thing, and how it drives business in the US and other countries. So, okay. So as far as these shortcomings, when we compare GDP from one year to the next, the size of household production and underground economy activity is about the same, so GDP growth is reasonable, but over long periods of time, extended years, the shortcomings might be more serious. If we think about the trend of women in the workforce, as that has increased over the past century, um, increases in GDP may exaggerate the increase in total production. So, household production has been replaced by paid childcare and takeout rather than being contained within the household, and that's a factor that could exaggerate increases in GDP. Okay. We talked a little bit about the underground economy. Um, I mentioned before that you could refer to it as the above ground economy, but there are actually real terms for those things. The underground economy is referred to as the informal sector, as opposed to the formal sector, which is what's actually being measured. And then finally, some other things to note about GDP. GDP per capita is often used to represent differences in standards of living from country to country, but it doesn't reflect leisure value, the potential negative effects of production, such as pollution, crime, other social issues, distribution of income, those things um, aren't measured. And so, if we think about if some of those items were improved, that would actually result in a lower GDP per capita. So, think about crime. If there was lower crime, governments may spend less on um, policing, prisons, private security, etc. That would decrease GDP, right? But it would result in other improvements in economic well-being. So, okay, so now we're going to move on to real GDP versus nominal GDP. So, let's suppose GDP increases. How do we know if the increase is due to an actual increase in production or due to prices increasing? We know this because we calculate two types of GDP, nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP measures final goods and services evaluated at current year prices, while real GDP measures value of final goods and services at base year prices. Okay, so base year can be any arbitrarily chosen year. The current standard is going to be 2012 is our base year. And although relative prices change from year to year, the BEA uses chain weighted prices to address this distortion due to relative price changes from year to year. And so chain weighted prices use previous year prices to adjust current year production. So we're going to do a calculating real GDP example. This little chart that I drew in here, it's located on slide 31 in your PowerPoint. So that's what we'll be using to run our calculations here on the side. So in order to first calculate real GDP and nominal GDP, we need to be given quantities and prices. So if I were to ask you to calculate real GDP in 2012, how would you do that? Well, real GDP uses base year prices. So we need to take 2012 quantities and 2012 prices to calculate real GDP in 2012. So we would take these specific quantities and prices, and we would get a total of 5,540, which is 40 times 80, 11 times 90, and 90 times 15. My screen is very sensitive today. So that is 3,200 plus 990 plus 1,350 equals a total of 5,540. Okay, so now what if I ask what is real GDP in 21? Real GDP in 21, we would need to take 2012 prices and 2021 quantities. Remember, real GDP is in base year prices. So we need 2012 prices. So 40, 11, and 90 times 2021 quantities. So 100 times 40 would be 4,000. 80 times 11 would be 880, and 20 times 90 would be 1,800. So we add these together and we get 6,680 for our real GDP in 2021. So if you don't understand where I'm getting this, you need to think about the definition of real GDP. Again, it's the quantity of that year in base year prices. Okay. So what if I were to ask you to calculate nominal GDP in 2021? Nominal in 2021, what would we need to do? We would need to take 2021 quantities and 2021 prices. Again, nominal GDP is in current year prices. So what would that be? That would be 50, 10, and 100 times 180 and 20. So that would be 5,000 plus 800 plus 2,000 equals 7,800. Okay, so now that we've established how to calculate GDP, which I highly encourage you to make sure you understand because it will be tested and there is a practice worksheet uploaded for you, we can calculate our GDP deflator. What is our GDP deflator? It's nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100, and it measures the price level. So we're interested in the price level because it measures average prices of goods and services in the economy. Price levels that are stable are desirable. They allow households and firms to appropriately plan for the future. And so we use this formula here to calculate that price level. So if I were to ask you what is the GDP deflator in 2021, how would you do that? You would take the nominal GDP in 2021, which is that, minus our real GDP, which is this, divided by our real GDP, which is that same number. And you would need to multiply this by 100, and we would get 16.77%. So, if I were to ask you how much the GDP deflator changed from one year to the next year, you would need to calculate it for each year. So we would calculate the GDP deflator in each year. You would be needed you would need to be given there the nominal and real GDP in each year respectively. And you could see how much prices changed. Okay. So, finally, last thing in this chapter is some other measures of total production, total income. We have the definitions here. Although the main one economists use is GDP, there are other measures including GNP, national income, personal income, and disposable personal income. So we'll be talking mostly about that disposable personal income later on in the semester, specifically referring to which goods and services within consumption are affected by economic growth, economic recession, etc. So, with that being said, that about wraps up this chapter. Again, there is a worksheet uploaded regarding calculating nominal and real GDP, understanding the GDP deflator. So I highly encourage you to work through that. If you have further questions, comments, or concerns, just feel free to send me an email. Have a great day. Bye.